In just 7 minutes of live television, before millions of American viewers, a handwritten letter from an African president brought Morgan Freeman to tears. The man known for playing God, for embodying justice in the voice of humanity, broke down in the hot seat. His hands trembled, his voice faltered, and then, before the cameras, he lowered his head. He couldn't go on. The question is, what was in that letter? What could possibly move a man who hasn't shed a single tear in public for over 5 decades? To crumble, live on air? What you're about to hear is more than a story. It's a forgotten secret, a bond no one ever spoke of, and a truth that even Hollywood never dared to face. Until now. It was a quiet Thursday morning in Los Angeles. Sunlight poured through the studio windows of Morning Window, casting a warm golden hue across the set, as if the entire city had collectively agreed to begin the day in peace. Inside the studio, the audience sat neatly in rows. Mostly middle-aged and older viewers, they weren't there for hype or headlines. They were there out of respect for the man seated at center stage, Morgan Freeman. Dressed in a simple charcoal gray suit, nothing flashy, nothing loud, he radiated the calm dignity of someone who had walked through decades of cinematic history. His deep, familiar voice echoed softly through the room as he spoke about his upcoming film, a project centered on racial reconciliation. The audience smiled, nodded, and leaned into the rhythm of his words. Each syllable he uttered carried the weight of a lifetime, a voice the world had trusted to narrate justice, hope, and the very soul of humanity. Opposite him sat host Olivia Sanders, her posture respectful, her smile gentle, eyes filled with reverence. Everything about the scene, the lights, the audience, the careful pace, felt like any other refined public appearance Morgan Freeman had given. It was measured, dignified, poetic. And yet no one in that room knew. Within minutes, everything would shift, radically, unforgettably. At exactly 8:07 a.m., the digital clock ticked forward. Olivia leaned down slightly beneath the glass table and pulled out a small, weathered envelope. Light brown, no official seal, no stamp, no national emblem, no markings of any formal diplomatic channel. Just one small, handwritten line. From the President of Burkina Faso. She said nothing, simply placed it on the table. Her fingers hesitated, as if even she didn't fully grasp the weight of what she was holding. Morgan looked at the envelope. He didn't touch it. Not yet. His gaze shifted. No longer the poised expression of an actor giving an interview, but something far more human. He stared with a kind of silent alarm, confusion, recognition, and fear. No one moved. The air shifted. Something unspoken had entered the room. Something far deeper than a film promotion. Morgan inhaled deeply, then slowly reached out with both hands and lifted the envelope. The stage light stayed steady, but in everyone's chest, something trembled. He began to open it. Not like a man opening a letter, but like someone unlocking a sealed memory, one he didn't know he had. His movements were slow, deliberate. The paper inside was soft, its edges slightly wrinkled, speckled with what looked like old water stains, as if someone had held it tightly for a long time before letting it go. Morgan's eyes scanned the first line, and then he froze. His hand stopped midair. His expression hardened. Time stalled. No one said a word. Olivia looked at him, instinctively wanting to help, but held back. This moment wasn't hers to interrupt. The cameras slowly zoomed in. The shot narrowed and the world watched only him. Morgan Freeman, the voice of God, of presidents, of prisoners and prophets, sat still, his eyes turning red. Not from pain, but from something awakening deep inside. He read the first line aloud. To the voice that carried our stories when we were forgotten. It was only a single sentence, but coming from his voice, a voice that had carried entire generations through stories of humanity. It struck like a thunderclap of truth. His lips trembled, his hands clenched the letter, and then he broke, quietly, completely. His head bowed, his chest heaved, and silence swept across the studio like a wave. An elderly woman in the third row raised her hand to cover her mouth. A man beside her closed his eyes, unable to bear the sight of his hero coming undone. Morgan tried to breathe. His hand went to his chest, but his throat had closed. He couldn't speak. The letter trembled in his hands, not because of nerves, but because every word on that page was a blade cutting into a part of him he had long hidden away. No one moved. Not a sound. Not a single director called cut. No cue for commercial. Olivia remained still, hands folded gently, watching a man confront something greater than performance. This was no longer a talk show. This was a moment suspended in time, Shabaim, where the soul of a man, long admired for his strength and wisdom, was cracking open on live television. Not from scandal, not from shame, but from something deeper, something sacred. We still don't know exactly what that letter said, not all of it, but we know it wasn't just a thank you note from a president. It was a calling, a reckoning, a reminder of how deeply one man's voice had reached, into villages without names, into stories never filmed, into souls long erased from history. And the question now echoed in every mind watching. What truth did that letter carry? That even Morgan Freeman, who once played God, who narrated the meaning of life, liberty, and loss, could no longer find the words. No one had ever seen him like this. He didn't try to hold it together. He didn't try to be the legend. He just sat there, a human being torn open by the past. And in that raw, shattered silence, we knew this wasn't just the beginning of another story. It was the unraveling of something real, something painful, something long buried. And it needed to be told from the very beginning, with truth, with heart. Morgan Freeman sat on the stage that morning not as a celebrity promoting a film, but as a man who had just spent a sleepless night wrestling with something deeper. The handwritten letter from the president of Burkina Faso had stayed with him through the darkness, each word echoing in his mind long after the cameras had turned off. He had not returned to the studio out of obligation, but because something within him remained unresolved. There was no music, no flashy introduction, no applause cue. Just a quiet studio lit by soft overhead lights, illuminating the weathered dignity on his face. The kind of stillness that made everyone feel they were standing before something sacred. In the center of it all lay a slightly wrinkled sheet of paper, delicate and unassuming, yet carrying the weight of memory from a world away. Nobody knew what would happen next, but everyone could sense it, that this moment was no longer about entertainment. It was about truth, about presence, about something that had waited far too long to be spoken. Holding the letter in both hands, Morgan's demeanor was different this time. The shock had passed. What remained was a solemn readiness, a kind of quiet surrender. He began to read again, his voice slow and deliberate. I grew up in the village of Zuno. And with those words, something in the air shifted. This was no longer just a letter. It was a doorway, and everyone in that room was being asked to step through it. His voice, familiar to generations, carried the weight of someone no longer performing, but bearing witness. We had no electricity, no running water. Our village had only one old truck left behind by the government. Once a month, someone would crank it by hand and mount a rusty film projector on the back. Simple words. But the picture they painted was vivid and haunting. A life where the only light came not from lamps or streetlights, but from flickering reels of black and white, casting moving images onto a torn white sheet stretched between two crooked bamboo poles. Morgan lifted his gaze, looking out into the audience as if inviting them into that memory. I could never have imagined that life could be so poor, and yet filled with such hunger. The room was breathless, not out of politeness, but because no one dared to interrupt what they were witnessing. It wasn't just a story. It was a crossing of timelines between a man of global renown and a child forgotten by history, connected through a beam of light and a voice in the dark. Everyone imagined those barefoot children on cracked red soil, sitting quietly, eyes wide with wonder. And in that silence, the true power of cinema was reborn, not as escapism, but as salvation. Morgan's voice softened as he read the next line. I didn't understand English. I didn't know what they were saying, but I remember one thing, that voice made me afraid to blink. He paused, gently lowered the letter, and rested one trembling hand on the table. His eyes drifted away from the audience. not in avoidance but in search. It was as if somewhere beyond the lights and cameras, he could see that boy, not on a screen, not in a crowd, but right there in front of him. I thought it was the voice of God, Morgan whispered. Years later, I found out it was you. The words dropped like stones into a well, their ripples stretching out in every direction. Somewhere in the crowd, someone stifled a sob. A man clutched his wife's hand. Even the seasoned crew backstage, people who had seen thousands of broadcasts, stood frozen, overwhelmed by a scene no script could ever stage. He tried to continue, but his hand trembled again. We had no books, no school, nothing but darkness. But that voice, it made us feel like we existed. It made us silent. It made us listen. And it made us dream. His voice cracked at the final word. He stopped, lips pressed tight, eyes closed as if bracing against a storm inside. And then gently, almost unwillingly, his body leaned forward. He bowed his head. The letter slipped from his fingers and landed on the wooden floor with the softest of sounds. And yet in that sound, there was a kind of collapse. The camera didn't zoom in. The director didn't cut. The frame remained wide and still, as if everyone instinctively knew that to get closer would be to violate something sacred, something unspoken that had finally found breath. No one in the audience moved. Olivia, the host, sat still across from him, her hands resting lightly on the table, her eyes fixed on his trembling frame. She didn't speak. She didn't interrupt. Everyone in that room understood. This was no longer a segment of a broadcast. This was a sacred unraveling. A man encountering his own past, not with pride or control, but with raw vulnerability. Nobody knew what else the letter contained, but everyone knew it wasn't just a thank you. It was a reckoning, a call, a reminder. It said that sometimes stories travel farther than we know. Sometimes the sound of a voice can cross continents, touch forgotten villages, and give dignity to people the world never saw. Morgan didn't try to compose himself. He didn't try to reclaim the image of a composed elder statesman. He just sat there, a human being with an open heart, slowly realizing the weight of his own influence. And somewhere backstage, a sound technician wiped away tears with one hand, the other still on the soundboard. Not a single audience member left their seat. Not a single breath was wasted, because they all knew with a kind of quiet certainty that they were witnessing something profoundly real. The moment when the man who gave the world so much hope was being reminded, in the most intimate way, just how far his voice had traveled. And in that stillness, one truth became unmistakably clear. You don't need to speak the same language to understand pain. You don't need subtitles to feel silence. And sometimes the most powerful thing in the world is a voice that simply knows how to listen. The recording had ended hours ago, but Morgan Freeman had yet to leave the studio. He sat quietly alone in the dressing room, no phone, no assistant, just a cup of cold tea and the folded letter resting neatly on his lap. Every offer to escort him out of the building had been gently declined. No one pressed him. Everyone understood. He didn't need time to think. He needed space to breathe. It was the kind of silence born from something unspoken, the kind of soul-deep fracture that no words of comfort could patch over. When he finally returned home near midnight, Morgan didn't change clothes. He didn't turn on the main lights. His apartment was still and dim, illuminated only by the soft amber glow of a bedside lamp. The letter was placed beside him, not as a piece of paper, but as something sacred, a doorway he hadn't yet stepped through, but couldn't look away from either. Lying there, he opened the letter again, then again. His tired eyes moved across the words with a gaze that was equal parts affection and pain. With each rereading, he felt himself drawing closer to the heart of the man who had written it, and at the same time brushing against a part of his own memory that had long gone untouched. The words were simple, handwritten, carrying the cadence of someone who had lived through war and shadow, yet somehow preserved a quiet flame of gratitude. Morgan read and felt as though the writer was there in the room, not as a head of state, but as a boy from long ago, sitting in the dust, dreaming through the sound of his voice. I carried your voice into the jungle, Morgan read aloud, his tone gravelly and low. It was the next line in the letter. President Traoré described his youth as a soldier, surviving between gunfire, hunger, and the looming terror of being forgotten. The men in his unit had little, old weapons, meager rations, and memory. And strangely, that memory wasn't of home or family. It came from flickering films shown long ago in a village clearing. At night, when the rain soaked my hair and I wasn't sure I'd live till morning, I'd whisper one line you once read. The letter said, "Hope is a thing with feathers." Morgan lowered the paper slowly, his hand pressed to his forehead, as if to brace against the wave of memory rushing in. That line, that poem, he had read it years ago in a documentary, just another assignment, just another piece of narration among thousands. But to that soldier, it was a prayer, a lifeline, a final thread keeping him from falling apart. "We repeated your words like blessings in the dark," the letter continued. "Once a wounded soldier could no longer speak, but he still managed to write one of your lines on his hand and died with it still there." Morgan clutched the letter, his fingers tightening until the paper crinkled. And then the tears came, quietly, not sobbing, not shaking, just a heavy, silent grief that rolled out in slow drops, each one carrying the weight of not knowing, of having lived so much life and still missing the depth of what his voice had meant to others. He lowered his head to the page, almost as if seeking shelter in the ink, something to lean against so he wouldn't collapse completely. It wasn't pride, it wasn't the glory of being remembered. It was the aching realization that he had spent a lifetime speaking on stages, in studios, at award shows, without ever knowing how many people had held on to his voice just to survive. People far away, people with no electricity, no applause, no social media to thank him. And yet, they remembered him in the most sacred way possible, by holding his voice in their hearts through war. The letter closed that section with a sentence that left him motionless. "You are not just an actor. You are the guardian of hope for those who have nothing left to believe in." Morgan looked up at the ceiling, where the soft light flickered faintly, casting quiet shadows across the room. He exhaled, long and slow, then folded the letter carefully and placed it back on the nightstand, not like something finished, but like a will that could not yet be sealed. The room remained bathed in the faint glow of the old bedside lamp. Morgan Freeman sat motionless beside the wooden table near his bed, the letter now folded neatly, resting in front of him like something too fragile to touch again. He stared at it in silence, as if any contact might awaken more memories he wasn't ready to face. Then, as he reached to gently close the letter for what he thought would be the last time, something thin and weightless slipped out from between the pages. It made no sound, just a soft fall, so light it barely disturbed the air, but it stopped his entire world. It was a black and white photograph. The edges were worn and curled slightly with age, touched by moisture and time. He leaned down and picked it up, his eyes narrowing the way old eyes do when trying to see more clearly. And then, something in him went still. His heart paused. The photograph showed a thin African boy, barefoot, standing in front of a makeshift movie screen. A sheet stretched between two leaning bamboo poles, just like the one described in the letter. But what froze Morgan wasn't the boy or the backdrop. It was the image projected onto the cloth. It was him, Morgan Freeman. His face lit up in mid-performance as Nelson Mandela in Invictus. The boy in the photo wasn't smiling. He wasn't speaking. He simply stared up at the screen, with the wide-eyed awe of someone looking not at an actor, but at a distant god who had somehow come close. Morgan whispered under his breath, barely loud enough to hear himself, "That's me." A chill swept through him. He turned the photo over. On the back, in shaky blue ink, were words written with care, the kind that looks like someone practiced many times before putting pen to paper. "This is the night I decided I would one day help my people, and your voice gave me that dream." Morgan read it aloud and then collapsed into the chair behind him, the photo still in his hand, his lips moving wordlessly. His eyes fell back to the letter, his hands trembling. He unfolded it again and scanned toward the bottom, seeking any lines he might have missed. And there they were, the final words, smaller than the rest, tucked near the margin like they weren't meant for public eyes, just for him. "His name was Cozy. He's gone now. But he was my family, and yours." Morgan froze. There is no preparation for a truth like that. That the boy in the photograph, the child who had looked at him with boundless admiration, wasn't just a nameless fan or a face in the crowd. He was family, blood, a piece of Morgan's own lineage, separated by oceans, raised in poverty and war, and unknown to either of them until now. His head sank to the table. The photo slipped from his hand and fell to the floor, landing face down with no one to pick it up. There were no more tears, only a stunned, hollow quiet, the kind that fills a man when something inside him breaks and doesn't immediately know how to heal. I inspired my own blood and never even knew, he whispered, not to anyone else, but to himself, like a confession. A part of him felt guilt for not searching, for not knowing, for never being there when Cozy was alive. But deeper than the guilt was a seismic shift in how he understood destiny. That his voice, once just a tool for performance, for making a living, had become the match that lit a fire in a boy named Cozy, who had gone on to build a school in the jungle, among war and hunger. And that Cozy was family, was home. No more stage, no more lights, no more applause. Just a man alone, sitting in the dark, face to face with a truth so intimate, so painful, it left no space for performance. He had saved a soul connected to his own blood, but only after that soul had already been lost. And from that moment on, Morgan Freeman knew. His life had entered an entirely new chapter. A chapter no longer written by Hollywood scripts, but by blood, by memory, and by the stories the world had never told. The room hadn't changed since the night before, but something about the light had. It was no longer the warm amber glow from the old lamp, but a colder, bluer hue, like a thin layer of fog had settled over the past. Morgan Freeman sat quietly in the worn leather chair, the letter unfolded, the photo of Cozy placed neatly beside it. He didn't need to reread the beginning. He had memorized every word, but there was one section he had avoided for days. The final lines, the ones that were no longer memories or emotions, but a final incision to the deepest part of his soul. He took a long breath, pressed a hand to his chest, and began to read again. He built a school. Just 4 words, but they landed like a thunderclap inside him. President Traoré had written that despite growing up in poverty and conflict, Cozy spent his entire youth collecting bricks, persuading neighbors, even trading meals for building materials. He built a school, not for praise, not for recognition, but to plant seeds of hope in children like himself. A child who had grown up in the dark, yet chose to become the light for others. Morgan swallowed hard. The next sentence was the one he hadn't had the strength to face. He mouthed it silently, his fingers trembling once again. He died before he ever got to meet you, but he spoke of you every day. You were the reason, he believed. Morgan couldn't hold it in any longer. His throat tightened, like an invisible rope was pulling it closed. He covered his mouth with his hand, trying to hold back the sound, but failed. A sob escaped, then another, and finally the tears came again. Not like the first wave, but slower, deeper. It was the kind of mourning that only comes when a father shows up too late to his own son's funeral. He's gone now, the letter continued, but he was my family too. The sentence was short, final, like a period at the end of a symphony that never got to play its final movement. Morgan laid the letter down, both hands covering his face. He was no longer the great narrator, no longer the symbol of cinematic wisdom. In that moment, he was simply an old man, grieving a blood connection he never knew existed, and now would never have the chance to meet. The next morning, Morgan returned to the studio. No announcement, no press, no props or setup. When he stepped onto the stage, the lights hadn't changed, but the audience had. No one clapped, no one cheered. They simply watched him, the way one might watch a man walking through a funeral procession that had no casket, no incense, and yet carried every ounce of sorrow that the human heart could hold. The studio fell completely still. No one stood, no one shifted. Morgan took his seat, bowed his head for a long moment, and then slowly looked up to speak. His voice was hoarse but steady. I came here today, not to tell my story anymore, but to finish a story that a boy began, one I never knew I was part of. He paused, reached into his pocket for a handkerchief, wiped his tears, and looked straight into the camera. Not as if addressing an audience, but as if speaking directly to Cozy, knowing full well the boy was no longer in this world. I've spent a lifetime speaking, but last night I heard a voice from a son I never held. And now I can't stay silent anymore. One by one, the people in the audience lowered their heads. A second passed, then another, then an entire minute, and no one said a word. That moment, an old man with his hand over his heart, eyes red, lips trembling, was no longer part of a television broadcast. It had become a ritual. A moment of mourning the world would never forget. Because sometimes in the death of one person, another finally begins to live for real. There was no announcement that day, no press release, no media banners, no opening music. The studio doors simply opened. But even in silence, everyone knew Morgan Freeman would return for the third time. And this time, he wasn't coming back as an artist promoting a legacy. He was coming back as a man reborn through grief. From early morning, the audience filled the seats. They sat in stillness. No one spoke above a whisper, as if attending a ceremony rather than a typical talk show. The cameras began to roll. The lights rose gently. And without cue, without fanfare, Morgan Freeman walked onto the stage. He wasn't wearing a suit. There was no polished presence of a silver screen icon. Just a simple dark blue shirt. The sleeves rolled slightly, as if he had just returned from somewhere far away and hadn't yet had time to rest. His face was calm, but something in his eyes had changed. It was no longer the gaze of a man who had walked through life on the stage. It was the west of someone who had walked through pain, real pain, and chosen to rise from it. He sat down without waiting for a signal, bowed his head, then slowly lifted his eyes to meet the camera, looking straight into it as if speaking to one person in the entire world. His voice, low and clear, broke the silence. I used to tell stories to the world, but now the world has told me mine. The room shivered with that line. Everyone who had known Morgan Freeman as a legendary storyteller now realized something new. He had become part of the very story he once only narrated. He wasn't just repeating the tales of others anymore. He was living inside one, a story he never knew he was at the center of. He continued. He spoke about Cozy, about the photograph, the letter, about not knowing, not recognizing, not being there. And then he looked down at his open hands, as if holding something invisible yet unbearably heavy. I lost someone, he said. Someone I could have held on to, not with money, not with fame, but with presence. And from this day forward, I won't let that happen again. He looked back up. His eyes were red, but steady. I've spent a lifetime playing men of conviction. It's time I become one. He placed a hand on the table, then reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a sheet of paper. This time not a letter, but a declaration. Today, he said, voice firm and unwavering, I am announcing the founding of an organization. It's called the Cozy Project, Stories That Heal. The studio remained silent. No applause, not yet. People needed time to take it in. And then he explained, this project will fund schools across Burkina Faso and other impoverished communities in Africa, but not just schools, places of story, places where children can learn to tell their own stories, in their own voices, in the language of their hearts. He paused, letting the moment settle, and then he said the most important words he may have ever spoken in front of a camera. I don't want to be remembered for the roles I played. I want to be remembered for the stories I helped children write, stories of their own lives. Each word dropped like a stone, heavy but solid. He lifted his head, his eyes shimmered, but there was no fragility. There was resolve, the quiet determination of a man who had been broken and had chosen to rebuild himself from the broken pieces. At the end, he stood, no bow, no waiting for applause, but this time the entire studio rose with him. No one cheered, no one filmed. They simply looked at one another, as if in this world of noise and spectacle, something truly real had just happened. And they knew it. There was no background music, no host to guide the show, no one left behind the soundboard to signal a cue. The final recording was nothing more than a single empty chair at center stage and a camera quietly rolling. Morgan Freeman entered in complete silence. He didn't come through the usual entrance of honor, the one line with polite applause and camera flashes. He walked in from backstage, holding a small, worn notebook and a sheet of paper folded neatly into thirds, the kind of page one might mistake for a prepared speech. But tonight, he wasn't reading from a script. He was about to say the one thing that had taken him a lifetime to find the courage to speak aloud. He sat down. The lights dimmed until only a soft circle of light surrounded him, like a fragile canopy of warmth in a world gone quiet with emotion. He opened the notebook, glanced at it once, then gently set it aside. His eyes turned toward the camera, not like an actor performing for millions, but like a man speaking to one child. To Cozy, to the boy standing before a flickering screen, to all the children without names, waiting in silence for someone, anyone, to raise their voice for them. I've told hundreds of stories in my life, he began, his voice steady, quiet. But in the end, I realized we don't tell stories just to be understood. We tell them so others can find themselves again. He paused, letting the silence deepen, letting every heartbeat in the room settle into the weight of that truth. Each of us is a line in someone else's story of redemption. We may never know who's listening, who's needing us, but that doesn't make our existence meaningless. He lowered his head, then looked back at the lens. This time, the gaze wasn't from a seasoned storyteller. It was from a father, a man who had lost a son, a man now speaking to every lost child in the world. His voice dropped into something soft, almost a whisper. You don't have to be famous to make history. You just need to speak with love. No one clapped. No one moved. Everyone sat still, as if held in place by an invisible thread connecting their hearts to that voice, a voice that had guided them through their youth, through sorrow, through hope, a voice now reminding them of something they always knew but never dared to fully believe, that love, sincerity, and a voice at the right moment could save a life. Morgan stood up. No bow, no goodbye. He walked out of the light, not like an actor finishing a performance, but like a father completing the first ritual of legacy. And when his figure disappeared behind the curtain, the lights dimmed to black. In that darkness, people began to cry. Not because they were moved by a scene, not out of pity, but because they had just witnessed something simple and seismic. That sometimes a voice doesn't need applause. It only needs to land in the quiet place where someone once felt forgotten. The story had ended, but the journey had only just begun. The letter from Burkina Faso didn't arrive merely to remind Morgan Freeman of a boy named Cozy. It came to remind the world of something deeper, that the greatest storyteller is not the one who speaks best, but the one who listens to pain and transforms it into light. And that light, if real enough, quiet enough, and steady enough, can heal an entire people. If this touched your heart, even just a little, we ask for only one thing. Don't let it stop here. Subscribe to our channel for more real, soul-stirring stories that remind us of the power of compassion, dignity, and silent courage. And if you believe the world needs more leaders like Ibrahim Traoré, leave a comment below with just one word: hope. Let's flood the world with it. Disclaimer: this video is a transformative, creative retelling inspired by real humanitarian values and public leadership. It is intended for educational and emotional engagement under the principles of fair use. We do not claim official affiliation with any government figure or entity. All visual audio materials used are edited and repurposed for commentary, inspiration, and social reflection.